Hey guys, Naz here. I've had a few requests to make a laying pattern tutorial. Now this is going to be pretty simple for you guys if you've been watching my recent pattern making videos. It's fairly similar to the process that really I make any quadruped pattern with. You're just changing the angle and position of the legs. So I made sort of a cute puppy with big buffy paws, but you could modify this to pretty much any four-legged animal. You could change them to hooves just by changing the way you attach the paws, doing a circle instead of doing the paw pads underneath, or you could change it to a cat or a dragon or whatever you wanted to. So I've just sketched out a basic shape in Photoshop of sort of a laying quadruped animal, and I'm going ahead and I'm just neatening up the pattern, and I'm drawing my front leg attached to the side body, and I'm going to be removing the barrier between these two pieces so it's all one same piece. I'm also adding a line where the thigh is going to cut into the side of the body, so between where that chunky thigh and the back of the belly is going to be, we're going to draw a line that cuts through there, and that's where our hip is going to pop out for the rest of the pattern. I'm also making a copy of the front leg to use as a template for the back leg so that they're roughly the same in shape and size. You can change this if you wanted to have a creature that had sort of a different, you might be making a griffin that has talons at the back and then paws at the front. When you're patterning your back leg, you want it to be tilting downwards slightly so that when the pressure of, the surface that it's laying on when this pattern is done is going to push that foot upwards. So you want to angle it down a little bit to give it a little bit of room for you to get in there and sew all those fiddly parts on the inner front of the leg, and yeah, it's going to be pushed up anyway when you end up sewing it and stuffing it. So now I'm just going to add a little dart at the top of the rump. I like to do this with most of my quadruped patterns unless you want a very flat rump. This gives it more of a round shape. So now I'm just going to make a copy of this entire pattern that we've already drawn and use that as a template to draw the inner, front and back leg pieces. So for your front leg, it's really just going to be making a copy of that and having it cut across where it intersects with the chest. And for the back, we're going to start at the top of the front hip. We're going to go down in sort of a half moon shape. We're going to stop sort of towards the back of the middle of the rump. You can go a little bit taller or a bit lower. It'll give you different effects depending on what you do, but I like to usually just go about halfway. So if you've seen me pattern before, the next step that I like to do is I like to go ahead and I like to put in key marking landmarks for where we're going to have our gusset align with. I'm also going to put in some of these little check marks on other parts of the pattern that I'm going to need to line up, so you can see I'm marking the same points on the outer leg pieces and the inner leg pieces so that when I'm pinning them together it gives me a little bit of a guide. Now I'm going to create the bottom paw pad section, so the bottom of both our legs and the bottom of the paw. I'm just fixing up the back a little bit here, making the pattern a little bit chunkier, just going by eye. So to draw the paw pad, I like to draw a straight line so that we're able to flip the pattern horizontally later on and make sure that it's perfectly symmetrical on both sides. I was initially just going to do a small paw pad at the front and then have the underneath of the leg meet up behind the paw pad, but I decided to change that and do a long sort of paw pad that runs all the way from the front of the toe to the back sort of elbow of the puppy. So you'll see here that I'm just going to line that up with the front, and I'm going to extend that so it's going to go all the way underneath the bottom of our leg. I like to do this just because it's a bit of a cleaner way to do the pattern. It's a bit easier. You don't have any sort of sharp junction at the back of the paw pad, but just extending that there and making a rough sort of underneath of the leg and paw integrated shape. You'll see what this looks like when I'm finished. Now I'm just going to put in some reference marks that I'm going to translate to the side leg pieces, and this is just going to help us pin this underneath paw piece to those side leg pieces when we do end up pinning them together, because it can be a bit tricky to sort of judge just by eye where everything needs to line up. So I like to do one mark on each side of the paw where it sort of changes direction. Then I'm probably going to go and put one in the middle and translate that to the side pattern pieces, and that's pretty much all you need to do. You really just need to make sure that the pattern piece is going to be the same length on one side as it is to the same length on the side pieces of those front paws. Now this is our under piece done for our front leg. I'm going to copy that and just change it slightly for the back leg. The back leg was a tiny bit shorter than the front. I don't know if you guys noticed that when I was initially patterning. I'm just going to repeat the same steps as I did before, starting at the front on both parts, rotating it around, adding those points so that when we're pinning, we just have to pin point to point, and it makes it much easier for us when we're doing that process, so everything is going to line up perfectly. And that's pretty much the legs, the body and the paws done. The only thing that we have to pattern now is the gusset. So before we went and we marked along all the markings that the gusset is going to need, what we're going to need to create the gusset. There's one more marking that we're going to need to make, and that's going to be on our inner thigh piece, because our tummy is actually going to run on the inside of the half moon shape that we've drawn for that inner back leg. It'll become a lot more obvious when I show you guys when I'm sewing if you haven't seen this kind of patterning before, so just watch that and then come back to this part here and it should make a little bit more sense. So you can see that we have the measurement of where the gusset is going to intersect the tummy on the outside of the half moon. So we want to pivot this spot here. We want to pivot the outside of the half moon to the inside of the half moon, so we have the same measurement, and we're going to make a marking on the inner part of that leg there and put a couple of points there, because the gusset is actually going to run along the tummy is going to pinch to the inside of that half moon shape, and then the gusset is going to follow the inner part of that big back leg piece up onto the rump. So now we're just going to draft our gusset. Really simple. If you guys haven't seen me do it before, all I do is I draw out a straight line, I rotate it along the edge that it's going to follow, so it's going to go down the neck, across the inner front leg piece, that's sort of the underarm, the armpit sort of area of the puppy. I'm marking all the key points along the way, so this is just getting all our measurements done, and I'm going to go, so this is going along the armpit here, and it's going to run along our belly. And then it's going to jump to the inner part of that half moon shape, so that's going to be sort of in the crotch area of the puppy, I guess. It's going to jump across his thigh. As I mentioned before, it'll be easier to see what I mean when you see me putting this together. And I'm just adding another little reference point halfway between that point and the top of the rump, just because that was sort of a big empty space. And we're going to be finishing it at the top of the back legs. That's where everything is going to finish, on the rump of the puppy. So now we're going to make sure that this line is nice and horizontal, and we're going to just mark in how wide we want our gusset to be at each of these points. So you can write the numbers if that helps you remember which point correlates to where. You don't want to make this too wide because that can really distort your pattern. A lot of the time I find when I'm patterning gussets, thinner is better. You can always go thicker later. You usually get better results with a thinner gusset. So I'm just sort of looking at, okay, point 1 at the top of the neck, I want that to be thinner. Point 3 is sort of the chest, that's where the leg is going to start. I want that to sort of be a little bit wider. Between point 3 and 4, that's going to align with the armpit. You want to create just a gentle indent there, and that's going to pull our armpit sort of area of the puppy inwards, the same as you would do on a sort of quadruped pattern. And I've just made the gusset a tiny bit thinner. That doesn't really change too much as long as you're not going really widely thick and then thin. Those measurements are still going to roughly line up with your side pattern pieces, because Minky has a bit of stretch to it. You can sort of fudge it to make it match if you need to. So I went ahead and before I printed this out, I drew the direction that the Minky needs to go. You'll see that on the finished pattern. And I've just gone and traced it out on all of our Minky pieces. I've changed the colours for each of sort of the pairs of pieces, or the type of pieces, so you guys can see a little bit when it's finished what goes where. It makes it just a little bit easier, but obviously your plush will probably all be the same colour, or it might have some markings on it. But I've made sure to cut along the line of that inner thigh piece, and that will be where our thigh little triangle, little half moon shape is going to pop into later on. So you're going to firstly sew the dart at the top of the rump, and that's just going to add that sort of roundness to the pattern. Now we're going to sew our inner leg pieces. So you're going to lay your outside body piece down, and then you're going to flip it over so that the minky side is facing upwards, and you're going to lay the corresponding inner leg pieces against that. So for the front leg, you want to sew along the top of the front arm, down the front of the paw. Don't sew underneath because our paw is going to go underneath that. You'll sew at this sort of little notch at the back of the front leg. For the back leg piece, we're going to sew alongside the outer piece of the half moon along the front of the back paw, and we're going to sew from where it lines up to the back of the rump all the way down to the bottom of the back foot. So you can see everything that I've sewn here, and I've left that bottom slit open for where we're going to be adding our bottom paw pieces. I've just trimmed away all the excess seam allowance. So the next step is going to be sewing our hip. So you can see that I've sewn the outer part of the half moon. Now we're going to sew the inner part of the half moon. So that is going to bring our belly along the inside of that half moon shape. So what we want to do is we want to sew along the inside of that half moon. We want to sew that line, the other line of where we cut through the belly. So you can see that I'm pinching at the top of our hip here, and you want to run that red piece along the yellow piece, so the inner part of the half moon. It's a little bit tricky to see, but you just want to pin where they intersect at the top, and we should have a line at the bottom of the yellow piece where we're going to align the bottom of the red piece. So you can see that it's going to run along that part there. Now you can hand sew this if you'd like. When I was starting out with these kinds of patterns, I always used to hand sew this because it's quite tricky, because we don't have any seam allowance on the red piece because we've just cut it straight through the middle of the minky. You can see kind of how the hip is forming here. So we're going to be sewing with the red side facing up, because you want to sew as close to the edge of that red line as possible. You're really going to be only giving yourself 1 or 2 millimeters, a tiny little fraction of seam allowance. Obviously not sewing so close to the edge that you're going to have gaps or it's going to pull apart. You want to sew just as close and as slowly as you can along that red parts, that red section there. So I'm just adding an absolute ton of pins. You want to pin, pin, pin as much as you can, especially if you're going to be machine sewing. You don't want this shifting at all. And I'm going to be pinning on both sides. So this is going to stop either part of our pattern from flipping over on itself. So you can see the yellow is sort of wanting to curl under itself. So we're just going to pin between all the other pins that we've already put in on the opposite side. And this is just going to absolutely force everything to stay flat while we're doing this sewing. And we're going to go ahead and we're just going to sew this little straight line here, and that's going to form our hip. So you can see how the point, that front point of the half moon shape, is going to push out our hip there. It's going to run across or through that little line that we cut through the belly and where it intersects the front of the hip. Now the hardest part is really done. All you're going to do is we're going to pin all of our long paw pieces in those gaps underneath our legs, and you're just going to use those little reference marks that we put in, so pinning the front of the paw to the front where the two side pieces intersect, and the same at the back. You're going to pin the back of the paw to where the back of the back leg pieces intersect, and then you're just going to pin all those other little reference marks that we put in. It's just going to help line everything up. Then I want you to go and pin the whole rest of it. So repeat the process for every single paw that you have to sew, and just get those all done. It's the same process for all of them. Pin on both sides to help yourself out a little bit. So now that we've done that, we're going to sew along our back seam, so starting at the top of the neck and ending at where the rump meets the back legs. And now we're just going to sew our gusset. Now for our gusset, we only want to sew one side at a time because it can be a little bit tricky if you try to do both at once. You'll get too many pins in there. So we're going to start the top of the gusset at the top of the neck. It's going to run down the neck, across the armpit, down the belly, and then it's going to run on the inside of those back legs up to the rump, where those back legs stop halfway up the rump. So we're going to use all our little key points that we put in earlier, aligning them to the key marks along this side of the body, those key points. It's going to make sure that everything lines up perfectly on both sides. And you're just going to Fill out the rest of it with pins, pinning on both sides so that your Mickey doesn't curl in on itself. And we're just going to sew along that line. Once you've sewn that, you'll cut away the seam allowance and then repeat it on the opposite side, and then you've pretty much closed up your entire plush. So our puppy's pretty much all sewn. We're just going to flip him inside out. You can use some sort of tool to help push out those long legs. This is a pretty small version, but you can easily scale this pattern upwards if you wanted to make a larger laying pattern. I think this pattern came out to about 7 inches long or something like that, so it prints on a single piece of A4 paper, but definitely scale it. You know, if you wanted a 14-inch long puppy, you would just scale it up to 200% and split it and sort of tape the pieces together so that when you trace them out onto the paper, you're going to have a puppy that is twice as large. So now I'm just going to do a quick job of stuffing him to give you guys an idea of what he's going to look like, and then after that we're going to go ahead and just do some very quick thread sculpting on his paws to give him paws instead of these sort of long sausage shapes that his feet currently are now. You'll probably notice that his feet look quite oversized, but once you pinch them down with that thread sculpting, it's going to really reduce the height of those paws. So it can be better sometimes to make it a little bit taller, especially if you're going to be using thread sculpting and adding those big woofy paws at the end, because yeah, that will squish the paw vertically, make it a little bit less tall. So we're going to try and get as much stuffing as we can in those joints. If you wanted them to be floppy, you could definitely add something like poly pellets in the joints, and then you would have a very floppy laying plush. So here's our final pattern of our puppy. I think it's turned out really well. You can see how the front legs are quite nice and close together because our gusset isn't too wide, and you can see how adding that sort of half moon piece in the thigh has kicked those thighs outwards. So you have our back legs sitting out from the body, and it sort of creates this nice natural sitting shape. You can see that also the Minky has sort of pulled those back legs upwards. They're not facing down like in our initial pattern, so you'll usually find that the Minky is going to pull those back legs upwards. I don't know why it does that at intersections, it just usually does. You can see all the different pieces are colour coded. Hopefully this will give you an idea of how the pattern fits together, but obviously this would look a lot nicer if it was all one colour. If you wanted to have the front legs more splayed out, you could have a thicker gusset section in that underarm area, but overall I think this works quite nicely for just a basic sort of puppy pattern, but you can modify it to how you see fit, making your own pattern. I hope you guys learned a bunch in this. I really like how this plush came out. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to send me a message on Patreon or social media, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!